It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Lena Tillett. The news this week has been head-spinning. We had a rare joint visit from President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris in Raleigh. The campaign stopped, making it clear Biden and Harris want to put North Carolina back in play for Democrats in the race for the White House.
21 million people covered under ACA, a 75% increase just since Kamala and I came to office. And that includes over 1 million folks right here in North Carolina. Folks, if America sends me a Congress that are Democrats, I promise you, Kamala and I will restore Roe v. Wade as the law of the land again.
However, overshadowing their visit was an unbelievable catastrophe in Baltimore.
One of you guys on the south side, one of you guys on the north side, hold all traffic on the Key Bridge. There's a ship approaching. It just lost their steering. So until you get that under control, we got to stop all traffic.
This massive container ship, said to be roughly the size of the Chrysler building, lost power, including to its engines, causing it to crash into the Francis Scott Key Bridge. This nearly 2-mile bridge tumbling down within seconds, taking with it, sadly, 8 construction workers who were said to be filling potholes on the bridge that morning, killing all but 2. There is a lot to discuss about how this happened, what processes were followed, and not, and where we go from here. And so many around our country, including right here in North Carolina, are wondering about the vulnerability of our bridges and ports. We are happy to have Campbell University professor and marine historian Sal Mercogliano joining us now to try to help us understand this tragedy just a bit better. Why don't we begin, Professor, with what you know about this Dolly cargo ship? That's the name of the ship that was traveling through the port of Baltimore.
Sure. So Dolly was a Singapore-flagged vessel. It was operating for Maersk Lines, which is one of the largest container liners in the world. It had stopped a series of ports. Baltimore was its last port. The ship was heading toward Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean via the Panama Canal. This ship is kind of a medium-sized container ship. So you hear a lot of people talking about it big, but in truth, it's about a kind of mid-sized vessel, carries roughly about 10,000 TEU or about 4,000 containers on board. And the ship experienced a power outage on the way out, and that loss of power resulted in the ship losing control and eventually hitting that southern pillar of the Key Bridge and causing the collapse.
So here's what we know from authorities that's confirmed at this point. Lights went dark. They lost power. The ship started blaring alarms. The crew radioed for help, then dropped the ship's port anchor. And then the Mayday call went out. This is the extraordinary part, in my opinion, because Maryland authorities had less than 2 minutes to stop traffic from driving over that bridge. I lived in Baltimore for many years. I traveled that bridge so often, and I can't, the thought of that fact that they were able to stop cars from driving over that bridge really is remarkable. In your opinion, did the pilots and crew do everything that they should have done in this?
Yeah, I sailed ships for a living, and I could tell you that the most terrifying moment I ever had on the ship is when the ship got silent, because that indicated you lost power. It is pit of your stomach fear because you don't have control. So in those 4 minutes, what that crew was able to do is the Maryland pilots that were on board got on the radio, they sounded a Mayday. That's what you heard, that communication for them to stop traffic on the bridge. Fortunately, this is early in the morning. This wasn't rush hour where you could have had tens of, even hundreds of people on board. The dropping of the anchor, they were doing everything they could to try to stop that vessel. The problem is this ship is over 100,000 tons in weight, and trying to stop a ship, even with an anchor moving at 10 miles per hour, is extremely difficult. And once they lost control and they couldn't get control back, there was very little they can do.
So you think there was no way that they somehow could have changed direction?
Well, we do have questions, and this is why the NTSB is doing questions. We see the power come back on. That is the emergency generator. They should have been able to have power to be able to steer with the forward momentum of the ship and with emergency power going to the rudder. They should have been able to navigate through the span of the bridge without hitting the pillar. That is a question that we're going to see investigated by the NTSB. They just took off the vessel's black box, the vessel data recorder. This is what we're going to want to hear about in the investigations with the pilots and with the crew.
So the AP is reporting that back in June, inspectors did find an issue with the machinery and the propulsion with this specific ship, but another inspection in September showed that it was fine. I mean, what are we to make of that?
This ship is a Singapore flag vessel. It's a very good registry. Ships undergo inspection when they come into foreign ports. It's under what's called a port state control for us. It's the U.S. Coast Guard that does that. And this ship, even the violation that it had down in Chile, was a very minor one. So this is a ship with a good track record. However, I will say that the U.S. Coast Guard, which is kind of unsung in the role they have, they do 11 missions, and the 11th mission here is vessel inspection. They just don't have the resources, personnel to do enough inspections of these vessels. So again, part of this investigation is going to be going back, looking at records and see what kind of maintenance and material condition the ship was in when it departed from the berth the other day.
I've heard you say that you thought maybe there should have been some tugboats that should have accompanied the ship when there was any indication that it was having issues with maybe electrical issues. Is that still your opinion?
Well, if the ship had been experiencing difficulties, then that should have been conveyed to the pilots. And the pilots probably would have requested that the tugs that helped take the ship off the Seagirt terminal would have stayed with the vessel through the voyage if there was any potential of that. But understand, it's not normal practice for ships to have tugs sailing along with them. 99.99% of the time, ships are going under spans like this, and we don't think twice about it. So, you would have to have an indication of that. And according to the pilots and information that's been relayed to us by the NTSB and the Coast Guard, there was no indication of any problems on the ship until power was lost.
Okay, so then that brings this question, which so many people are feeling right now. Is our infrastructure vulnerable? I mean, do you see major policy or regulations implemented now because of this disaster?
When you saw what happened down in 1980 down in Tampa with the Skyway Bridge, one of the things, if you look at the new bridge that was built in its place, it had these massive dolphins put around it, these big concrete blocks. The main pillars were on artificial islands so that something like this couldn't happen. But what we've seen over the past 20 years is the size of vessels have increased, and we've also increased the velocity in which we move traffic. And Port of Baltimore just underwent a massive expansion. It dredged the harbor. It brought in new cranes to offload vessels like this, but there wasn't an examination of the infrastructure. And unfortunately, there are many bridges like this that are vulnerable to potential hits. And this tends to be a very low order in terms of where we spend our infrastructure dollars.
Do you think now there will be some changes at the pillars of these bridges as a result?
Unfortunately, most maritime law is written in blood, and this is an element, and it takes a loss of life for us to realize that this has to happen. We should have learned this in 1980, but ships in 1980 were a much different size. These vessels are much bigger. When they built this ship in 1977, you would expect a 500-foot ship, maybe 20,000 tons going under it. Dolly is almost 1,000 feet and 110,000 tons. So, it's the scope and scale has changed, and we really have to look at all our infrastructure when we do these port upgrades.
Where do you see the investigation going from here? We know the NTSB is taking charge of the investigation, and they seem like as if they really want to do a thorough job. Where do you see this going next?
Well, there's going to be a very in-depth investigation, and it's a very complicated one. As I mentioned before, this is a Singapore flag vessel under a Singapore company. The owner is Japanese. The leasing company is Danish. The insurance company is British. And the crew is Indian. And the deals you're going to be dealing with here are multifaceted. So it's going to be long and complex. One of the things that the NTSB is doing right now is trying to grab as much physical evidence they can off the vessel and to get the crew deposed so that they can find out exactly what happened.
What about the salvage operation moving forward?
Yeah, that's the next big element we're going to see here. There are three elements of this salvage. You've got the ship itself, which has not yet been removed, and this is a big salvage to do. So we see the Coast Guard has contracted with a company to do that. The Army Corps of Engineers, which is in charge of the maritime channel, they want to open up that shipping channel. They have brought in another salvage company to do this. And then the Maryland Department of Transportation has another salvage company coming in to do the bridge. My fear is they have stood up a unified command structure, but they have not appointed an overall incident commander. And if you don't have one person in charge, this has the potential to turn into rule by committee, and they can be competing for resources.
Isn't that the NTSB? Didn't they say they have control?
NTSB has control of the accident site, but once they release the ship, then the salvage changes hands. So captain of the port, which is the senior Coast Guard officer, will have command of it, but he has not yet been designated as the overall salvage incident commander. And, you know, when we've seen accidents like this happen, for example, Deepwater Horizon, the commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Thad Allen, went down and took the incident himself.
Final question to you, and this is really kind of a feeling question. This was remarkable for so many to see this bridge that had been in existence for decades just come crumbling down within seconds. Where do you rank this disaster? I mean, is this truly something you never expected to see, or was this always potentially a risk?
We've seen maritime disasters involving infrastructure. I mean, again, 1980 with Tampa, we had that. We tend to see it on a much smaller level. But just this past year, we've had two similar incidents around the world where this happens. And again, you know, we tend to have a little bit of sea blindness in this country. We don't really realize the importance that global trade and commerce has. And we need to be aware of this. And like I said, when we do these kind of port upgrades and try to bring these bigger ships in, we really need to be concerned because unfortunately, this is a preventable accident. If there were some provisions that were put in place here, we may not have had this accident. But what we need to do is look forward now and make sure we don't have a repeat of this in the near future or even the long term.
Professor Mercogliano, thank you so much for your insight. And again, we are certainly thinking of the families who have lost loved ones as a result of this tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, we are going to talk about President Biden and Kamala Harris's visit to Raleigh this week. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris spent hours in Raleigh on Tuesday, first stopping by Chavis Community Center for a campaign event, then attending a private fundraiser where Governor Cooper says they were able to raise more than $2 million. Here's WRAL's Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie's report for that day.
Before a small invitation-only crowd here at Chavis Community Center, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris touted their administration's efforts to make health care more accessible and affordable.
Access to health care should be a right and not just a privilege. No matter who you are, where you live, or how much you earn.
Our recent WRAL News poll found that health care is a top issue for North Carolina voters this year. Among black voters, health care is the top-ranked issue, with nearly half rating it 10 out of 10 in importance. It's tied with the economy for top issue among women voters and young voters, like UNC student Josahandi Avila.
Healthcare is very, very important, especially with the rises of many, many diseases. So I think it's really important for us to hear straight from the source on what's being done, what plans for the future, and then how the next 4 years could go.
Meredith College political science professor David McLennan says focusing on health care is a strategic choice for Biden.
If you look at the constituencies he's going to need to win North Carolina, he needs women, he needs people of color, he needs young voters.
And having Vice President Kamala Harris by his side, a rare occurrence on the campaign trail, could make it easier to get through to voters like Estorine Davis.
I think that's really awesome. As a black female, it's nice to be in the same room with our first black female vice president.
And joining us now to talk about the visit and other big political headlines this week, Western Carolina political science and public affairs professor Chris Cooper. Professor Cooper, great to see you. So this was Biden's final stop on his battleground state tour after the State of the Union. He visited, obviously, all 7 states, choosing to do this visit, though, with Vice President Harris. I don't think people understand that. That's really rare. One, just because of all the logistics that are required to even make that possible. So what did you make of both of them coming to Raleigh?
I mean, I think it really puts a punctuation point on how important they think that North Carolina is in this presidential election. I mean, it is not just a battleground state. I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that it is the battleground state in the way that it's the one state that Biden might be able to pull over to his side. Sure, North Carolina went for Trump in the last presidential election, but his margin in North Carolina was the smallest of any state in the country. If there's one to pick off for Biden, it's North Carolina.
We should say WRAL's recent polling shows that former President Trump is currently ahead of President Biden in the polls by a pretty significant margin. So let's talk about their decision to focus on health care while here. Do you think that was smart?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very smart move, right? I mean, one, it's a short jog from healthcare to abortion rights. And I think that's something that we're going to see Democrats leaning into throughout the country. Certainly, we saw that in the Alabama special election this last week. It was a state legislative seat. Not a lot of folks paying attention to it, but a Democrat won a tough seat there. And I think the conventional wisdom there, part of it was about leaning into abortion rights as part of health care. And so it's an issue where people tend to trust the Democratic Party. It's a winning issue for Democrats. I'm not surprised to see Biden-Harris team going hard on that issue. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future.
Obviously, expanding Medicaid, very popular in North Carolina. We learned this week that 1,000 people a day are signing up for Medicaid. What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Look, it was a win. I mean, the Republican General Assembly for a very long time said no to Medicaid expansion, and they finally went for it for a variety of reasons. But the bottom line is it is perceived as an issue where the Democrats won, right? The Democrats got a policy win in a state where the General Assembly is controlled by Republicans. Those don't come along every day. I think they're going to lean in on that heavily all the way through November.
All right, let's talk about some of the other big races that we will be seeing on the ballot come November. First, we have to make sure that we know who the candidates will be. Absentee ballots going out this week for the runoff elections happening on May 14th. A number of races. The big one in our area is for the 13th district between Kelly Daughtry and Brad Knott. You've been thinking a lot about how unique this process is for North Carolina, the implications for having all of these runoff elections in this state. What should we be thinking about that?
You know, one, I think we just need to remind ourselves it's a choice. I'm not going to say whether it's a good choice or a bad choice, but there's only 10 states in the country that have runoffs in the first place. They all tend to be in the United States South. It's left over from the bygone era of the overwhelmingly solidly Democratic South, which may seem like a very long time ago because it was. And we're still governed by that. Look, this is really important. We're going to have very, very, very low voter turnout. You take the primary election turnout and you slice that in half or even smaller to get to this second primary or runoff turnout. You say, well, Chris, can it really matter? Doesn't the winner just win the second time around? And the answer is that it does matter. And the first winner doesn't always win the second time. So some folks may remember a guy named Madison Cawthorn from my neck of the woods out west. He lost the first primary, won the runoff. A guy named Patrick McHenry, he of the big gavel, right? He was the temporary Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He lost his first primary. He had to go to a second primary or runoff to win. Mark Walker, same thing when he came into office. So we do sometimes see these flip from the first to the second primary in ways that are politically consequential.
We also, I'm sure, are seeing how expensive races become because you have to run so many races, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we're talking about running 3 races now, right? They've got to run the primary, they've got to run the second primary, and then they have to run the general election. So for Congress, look, they can probably make that work. It's not going to be that competitive in the general. But let's think about something like the state auditor. Not the kind of thing people pay a lot of attention to. We have a runoff for auditor on the Republican side. We have a runoff for lieutenant governor on the Republican side. They had to run a primary, they got to run a second primary, and then one of them is going to have to run in probably a very competitive general election as well. It's going to cost a lot of money.
What was it, roughly 24% of registered voters voted in the primary? You're expecting turnout to be even lower?
Yeah, I'm expecting probably half of that to turn out, and that's not half of the 24%. That's half of the ones who showed up on the Republican side in that primary. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny number of voters who are going to make a really important decision about who's going to be the candidate in the general, and potentially who's going to be our state auditor, our state lieutenant governor, our member of Congress in the 13th congressional district moving forward.
I want to show you this exchange between State Superintendent of Public Instruction candidate Michelle Morrow and a CNN reporter. We just have to take a quick break. I'll do it afterward. Welcome back. Let's take a look at this clip between Michelle Morrow and a CNN reporter. Michelle Morrow surprisingly winning her primary race for State Superintendent of Public Instruction against a well-known incumbent candidate, Catherine Truitt. She has come under fire for some controversial posts and comments that she has made in the past, and CNN confronted her about it. Let's take a look.
Hi, Ms. Morrow. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing fine.
All right. How did it go in there?
Hey, it went great.
Yeah?
It went great.
You feeling good?
Who are you guys with?
I'm Shimon Prokopez. I'm with CNN.
Oh, have you been parked in my neighborhood by any chance?
We've been trying to talk to you, yes.
Okay. Well, you can go through my
I understand,
campaign.
but I have you now, so why
Thanks.
don't we talk now?
No need.
Why not? Well, I want to ask you, do you still stand?
late and we're
I'm not
gonna go
talking to you,
now.
ma'am. Do you
Okay.
still stand by your comments about former President Barack Obama and that he should be executed, calling for the death of other presidents? Do you stand by that? Do you stand by those comments?
Have a good night.
Do you stand by
Thanks.
what you've said about the public education system and that it needs to be destroyed?
No comment.
Do you stand by that?
No comment.
Do you understand the concern that people have
No
with this
comment.
nomination
Hey,
that you now
I have a
have?
question. Do you vote in North Carolina? Then keep your eyes on your own paper.
All right, Professor Cooper, what did you make of that exchange?
I mean, look, it's uncomfortable. I think just as a human being watching that, it's incredibly uncomfortable. I think it illustrates a lot of kind of where we are in terms of national politics, right? Everything has been nationalized. We're paying attention to state level offices nationally, but also I think it also points out what Michelle Morrow wrote was, let's be honest, pretty reprehensible. And she really hasn't responded, at least very much, to people's satisfaction to that. So you've got kind of, these pretty reprehensible comments, and then you've got a very, very uncomfortable encounter. I think that's we're going to see more of that before we get to November.
I did wonder about her last comment, though, when she asked, are you from North Carolina? Do you vote in North Carolina? And thinking that might resonate with a lot of voters who are saying, well, that is true. Why are you sticking your nose in North Carolina's business? Do you think that that might resonate with voters?
Sure. I think that's absolutely going to resonate with voters. I think it's going to do a couple of things. One, it's probably going to make some folks lean a little more into her. I think, right, these states' rights kinds of arguments, stay, mind your own business, national media. We've heard that for years and years and years. At the same time, it's going to expand the scope of conflict. When we think about who Mo Green's be able to raise money from, it's now a national audience, right? Somebody got up that day in Bozeman, Montana, turned on CNN, learned about Michelle Morrow. Maybe they liked her, maybe they didn't. They are now clued into our race, and some of those folks may be able to write checks. So I think we're going to see a much more national operation for the kind of office that we're not used to getting national attention, frankly.
Yeah, and it's important to note here that a lot of voters don't watch the news every day. They certainly don't read political news every day, and they may not have known about some of the posts that she posted in recent years. Professor Cooper, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to talking to you in the weeks and the months ahead. It's going to be a very, very busy 2024 indeed. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can email us on the record at WRAL.com. You can find me on social media. I'm there. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great night.